The last light of autumn died behind the Arizona ridgeline like a prayer whispered into the wind, casting long shadows across the weathered ranch that sat like a forgotten monument at the base of the hills. The wind carried the promise of winter, sharp and unforgiving, rattling the loose boards on the barn and sending dust devils spinning across the empty yard like ghosts dancing in the fading light. Thomas Harrison stood at the window of his small cabin, one weathered hand pressed against the cold glass, watching the darkness creep across his land with the patience of a predator. At 33, he moved with the deliberate caution of a man who had seen too much death, his shoulders broad but weighted down by memories that refused to stay buried. The lines around his eyes spoke of squinting into too many desert suns and watching too many good men fall under foreign skies. The cabin felt larger than it should, empty spaces where laughter used to live, echoing with the hollow sound of solitude. On the mantel above the stone fireplace, a daguerreotype showed a young woman with kind eyes and gentle smile, her arm around a small boy with Tom's stubborn chin and his mother's bright eyes. Mary and Billy, gone 2 years now, taken by the fever that swept through the territory like a plague sent by an angry god. Their absence filled every corner of the room, making even the crackling fire sound lonely and lost. Tom turned from the window and walked to his workbench, where his Winchester 1873 lay partially disassembled, its brass receiver gleaming in the lamplight. The ritual of cleaning and oiling the rifle had become his evening prayer, each motion practiced and precise as a priest blessing communion wine. He ran the cleaning rod through the barrel, checking the action, ensuring every piece fit perfectly together like the parts of a well-ordered life. In a land where death could come from any direction without warning or mercy, a man's rifle was often the only thing standing between him and an early grave. The oil lamp flickered, casting moving shadows across the rough-hewn walls like spirits trying to escape their wooden prison. Tom calculated in his head the kind of mental arithmetic that kept a man alive out here in the wilderness. 2 days of lamp oil left if he was careful with the wick. Enough beans and salt pork to last through winter if he rationed properly and supplemented with whatever game he could bring down. 47 rounds for the Winchester, 12 for his Colt Peacemaker. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles away across broken country, in the nearest town might as well have been on the moon when the snows came down from the mountains. He had chosen this isolation deliberately, methodically, after everything that happened. After Little Bighorn in the screaming chaos of Custer's last stand. After the court-martial that never came because dead men tell no tales and live ones know when to keep quiet. After losing Mary and Billy while he was away on patrol, chasing Apache ghosts across the desert while his family died calling his name. Some wounds heal clean, others just learn to hide better beneath scar tissue and silence. Thunder rolled across the sky, though no clouds were visible in the star-scattered darkness. Tom's hand stopped on the rifle barrel, his head tilting slightly, like a wolf scenting danger on the wind. Not thunder. Hoofbeats, moving fast across hard ground, coming from the direction of the old Apache trail that wound down from the high country. But what horse would be out in weather like this, with a storm building like an artillery barrage and darkness falling like a black curtain across the world? He set down the cleaning rod with careful precision and moved to the window, pressing his face close to the cold glass. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and wind-blown dust dancing in the amber spill of lamplight from his cabin. Then a shape emerged from the gloom, stumbling more than riding, heading straight for his door, like fate itself coming to collect an overdue debt. Tom grabbed the Winchester and checked the chamber with automatic efficiency, his movements born of muscle memory and bitter experience. In 3 years of living alone out here on the edge of nowhere, no one had found his cabin by accident. The track was too hidden, too carefully concealed, the land too empty and unforgiving. Anyone who showed up at his door after dark was either lost, desperate, or hunting him for reasons that probably ended with a shallow grave. The figure drew closer, and Tom could see now that it was a woman, slumped forward in the saddle of a horse that looked ready to collapse from exhaustion. Her long, dark hair whipped in the rising wind like a battle flag, and even from a distance he could see the bone-deep weariness in every line of her body. She rode like someone who had been in the saddle for days, pushing both herself and her mount past the point of endurance and into the realm of pure, stubborn will. The horse stumbled on the rough ground, nearly throwing her, and Tom found himself moving toward the door before he made a conscious decision to do so. Whatever this woman's story was, she wouldn't last another hour in the weather that was building. The wind was picking up now, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of a hard freeze before morning. He opened the door just as she slid from the saddle, her legs buckling the moment her feet touched the ground. She caught herself against the horse's neck, breathing hard, and Tom could see now that she was Apache, her deerskin dress torn and stained with the dust of hard travel. Her face was gaunt with hunger and exhaustion, but her eyes held a fierce determination that made Tom pause with his hand on the doorframe like a man suddenly aware he was standing at the edge of a precipice. For a long moment they stared at each other across the dusty yard, the distance between them feeling both infinite and negligible. Tom with his rifle held loose but ready, the strange woman with her hand still gripping her horse's mane for support. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of sage and coming rain, and something else, something that smelled like desperation, and the kind of courage that came from having absolutely nothing left to lose. Then she spoke, her voice barely audible above the wind, but carrying clearly in the desert air like a gunshot in church. "No one wants me," she said, the words falling like stones into the silence between them. "I need a husband." The simplicity of it hit Tom like a physical blow, like taking a punch to the solar plexus when he wasn't expecting it. No explanation, no pleading, no elaborate justification. Just a statement of desperate fact delivered with the kind of exhausted honesty that came from walking to the very edge of the world and finding nothing but empty air beyond. She swayed on her feet, and Tom could see now that she was younger than he had first thought, maybe 24 or 25, with the kind of beauty that came from strong bones and stronger spirit. Her skin was the color of polished copper, her features a mixture of Apache severity and something softer, something that spoke of mixed heritage and the complications that came with walking between two worlds. "If I don't have one tonight," she continued, her voice growing stronger despite her obvious exhaustion, "I won't survive." Tom's grip tightened on the Winchester, not from fear, but from the weight of recognition. He had heard that tone before in the voices of soldiers who knew they were looking at their last sunset, who had counted their bullets and found the number wanting. The absolute certainty that came with standing at the edge of everything, with nowhere left to run and no cards left to play. The wind gusted harder, and the first fat drops of rain began to fall, striking the dust with soft impacts that sounded like distant applause. The woman's horse stamped nervously, its flanks heaving with exhaustion, foam still visible around the bit. She made no move toward the cabin, didn't plead or beg or try to manipulate him with tears. She simply stood there in the growing storm, waiting for his decision with the patience of someone who had already accepted whatever fate he chose to hand down. Tom studied her face in the lamplight that spilled from his doorway, looking for deception and finding only the kind of bone-deep weariness that was impossible to fake. There was Apache blood there, clear in the high cheekbones and the way she held herself even in exhaustion, but something else too. Something that spoke of mixing between tribes or between worlds entirely. Her dress was traditional deerskin, beautifully worked with intricate beadwork, but it was cut in a way that suggested some accommodation to white fashion. A woman caught between peoples, belonging fully to neither, wanted by none. His military training screamed warnings like bugles calling retreat. Apache raids had been increasing lately, growing bolder and more coordinated. A lone woman could be bait for an ambush, a carefully crafted trap designed to lure him outside where hidden warriors could cut him down like wheat before a scythe. He scanned the darkness beyond her, looking for movement, for the glint of metal or the silhouette of a crouched figure waiting for the signal to strike. But if this was a trap, it was an elaborate one, planned with theatrical precision. The woman's exhaustion seemed genuine, bone deep and impossible to manufacture. Her horse was nearly dead on its feet, its coat matted with sweat and foam, its breathing labored. And there was something in her eyes, a kind of desperate honesty that Tom recognized from his own mirror on the worst nights, when the ghosts of dead friends came calling and sleep became an impossibility. The rain began to fall in earnest now, heavy drops that struck the dust and filled the air with the rich smell of wet earth and the promise of flash floods in the arroyos. The woman didn't move, didn't seek shelter, just stood there letting the water run down her face like tears she was too proud to shed. Her horse lowered its head, accepting the rein with the resignation of an animal that had given everything and had nothing left to give. Tom made his decision with the same instinctive certainty that had once made him a good soldier and a trusted leader of men. He stepped back from the doorway and gestured toward the cabin with the barrel of his rifle, the motion as formal as a bow. "Come in," he said, his voice rough from disuse and the weight of unspoken grief, "before you drown out there." She hesitated for just a moment, as if she hadn't quite believed he would say yes, as if kindness was such a foreign concept that she needed time to recognize it when it appeared. Then she took a careful step forward, her legs shaking with exhaustion and something that might have been relief. Tom moved as if to help her, then stopped himself. Something in her posture warned him to keep his distance, to let her enter on her own terms and under her own power. She walked slowly across the yard, each step deliberate and carefully placed like a woman crossing a frozen pond of uncertain thickness. When she reached the doorway, she paused, meeting his eyes again with a directness that was somehow both challenge and surrender. Up close, Tom could see the full extent of her exhaustion. Her lips were cracked from thirst, her face gaunt with hunger that spoke of days without proper food. There were dark circles under her eyes that told the story of nights without sleep, days without rest, the accumulated weight of running from something that kept getting closer no matter how fast or far she traveled. But there was something else too, something that made Tom catch his breath, a strength that hadn't been broken despite everything, a dignity that remained intact even in the face of utter desperation. She stood in his doorway like a queen in exile, asking him for nothing but shelter, offering nothing but her presence and the mystery of whatever had driven her across the desert to his door. "Thank you," she said simply, the words carrying a weight of meaning that seemed to encompass more than just gratitude for shelter from the storm. She stepped inside and the cabin felt different immediately, as if her presence had somehow made it both larger and smaller at the same time. The walls seemed to expand to accommodate her, while the space between them contracted with the force of recognition of two damaged souls finding themselves in the same small room at the edge of the world. She stood just inside the door, dripping rainwater onto his carefully swept floor, and looked around with the careful assessment of someone who had learned to read a room for danger in the first few seconds. Her eyes cataloged everything: the rifle rack, the ammunition, the layout of windows and doors, the photographs on the mantel that spoke of loss and loneliness. She was measuring distances, calculating angles, preparing for whatever might come next with the automatic wariness of prey that had learned to think like a predator. Tom closed the door behind her and leaned the Winchester against the wall, the simple act of setting aside his weapon feeling strange and significant, more trusting than he had been with anyone in years, more hopeful than he had any right to be. But something about this woman made him want to offer that trust, to see if it would be honored or betrayed, to discover if he was still capable of faith in another human being. She moved toward the fireplace with unconscious grace, drawn by the warmth like a moth to flame, and Tom got his first good look at her in the steady lamplight. She was beautiful in the way that frontier women were beautiful, carved by hardship into something both fragile and unbreakable. Her deerskin dress was finely made, the work of skilled hands and patient hours, but it showed the wear of hard travel and harder choices. There was a tear near her left shoulder where the fabric had given way under stress, and Tom found himself looking away from the exposed skin beneath, respecting her modesty even in her moment of vulnerability. "You can sit," he said, gesturing toward the chair by the fire, the one that had been Mary's favorite place to read in the evenings when the world was simpler and hope was still possible. "I'll see to your horse." She nodded and sank into the chair with a quiet sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside, from a place where exhaustion lived in her bones like cold in winter. Tom grabbed his coat from the peg by the door and headed back outside, leaving her alone with his fire and his possessions and his trust. It was either an act of faith or an act of foolishness, and he wasn't entirely sure which. But sometimes a man had to choose between cynicism and hope, and tonight he was choosing hope. The rain was coming down harder now, turning the dust to mud and filling the air with the sound of water on wood and stone and metal. The woman's horse stood where she had left it, its head hanging low with the kind of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into the realm of spiritual defeat. Tom approached slowly, speaking softly in the low tones that horses understood, and led it toward the small barn behind the cabin. The animal was Apache trained. He could tell immediately from the way it responded to his guidance. It moved with pressure rather than force, cooperated with intelligent understanding rather than dumb obedience. This was a horse that had been treated as a partner rather than a possession, respected as a fellow creature rather than merely a tool. Tom rubbed it down with handfuls of clean straw, checking for injuries with gentle hands, finding nothing worse than exhaustion and the minor cuts that came from hard travel through rough country. He gave it water and grain, watching as it drank with the desperate gratitude of a creature that had been pushed beyond its limits and found mercy at the end of its endurance. The horse was a good one, well-bred and well cared for despite its current condition. It had carried its rider further than duty required, loyal past the point where loyalty made sense. Tom found himself wondering how far they had traveled together and from what manner of danger they had been fleeing. When he returned to the cabin, the woman had not moved from the chair by the fire, but she had pulled something from the folds of her dress, something she held in her hands like a prayer, or a weapon, or a memory too precious to release. Tom couldn't see what it was from the doorway, but the way she held it suggested either great value or great pain, possibly both. "Your horse will be fine," he said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door, with movements that felt suddenly formal and significant. "Tired but sound, he's a good animal." She looked up at him with something that might have been gratitude mixed with surprise, as if kindness to her horse was unexpected enough to merit comment. "He's a good horse," she agreed, her voice soft with affection. "He brought me further than I had any right to ask." The way she said it suggested this might be the end of their journey together, that whatever came next might not include the faithful animal that had carried her to safety. Tom felt an unexpected pang at the thought. He had grown fond of creatures that tried hard and endured much, and this horse had clearly done both in generous measure. "You hungry?" he asked, moving toward the stove that dominated one corner of the small cabin. It was easier to talk while he was doing something useful with his hands, easier to avoid the weight of her dark eyes and the questions they held. "Been a while since you ate, I'd guess." "Yes," she said simply, without shame or apology or the elaborate justifications that pride sometimes demanded. "I haven't eaten in 2 days." The admission hit Tom like a physical blow. 2 days without food while fleeing across the desert, keeping herself and her horse alive through will alone. He ladled beans into a tin bowl thick with molasses and salt pork, the kind of simple food that filled the belly and warmed the soul. He cut a thick slice of bread from the loaf Mary used to bake, back when there was someone to bake for, back when the cabin held more than echoes and regret. He set the food on the table and gestured for her to come eat, watching as she rose from the chair slowly, as if her body protested every movement. He noticed the way she favored her left side, either injured or simply exhausted past the point where grace was possible. She moved like someone who had been riding hard and sleeping little, pushing herself beyond reasonable limits because reasonable limits had become a luxury she couldn't afford. She ate with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned not to waste food, savoring each bite while trying not to appear too eager or desperate. Tom poured coffee into 2 tin cups and sat across from her, nursing his own cup while she ate. The silence between them was comfortable rather than awkward, the kind of quiet that came from 2 people who understood the value of not filling every moment with unnecessary words. The coffee was strong and black, the way frontier men drank it, and Tom watched her face over the rim of his cup. She had good features, strong bones that would age well if she lived long enough for aging to become a concern. Her hair was longer than most Apache women wore it, black as midnight and thick as winter darkness. Her hands were small but capable, marked by work and weather, but still graceful in their movements. When she finished eating, she leaned back in her chair and looked at him directly for the first time since entering the cabin, meeting his eyes with a steadiness that suggested both courage and calculation. "My name is Elena," she said, her voice clear and firm. "Elena Martinez." The name hit Tom like a physical blow, though he tried not to let his reaction show on his face. Martinez was an Irish name, not Apache, which suggested a story more complex than he had initially imagined. Mixed blood was not uncommon on the frontier, where necessity and loneliness often overrode social conventions, but it usually came with complications that pure heritage avoided. Tom Harrison, he replied, then added with deliberate formality, "You're welcome here, Elena Martinez." Something flickered across her face at the sound of her full name spoken with respect rather than contempt, and Tom wondered when she had last heard it used that way. Apache women who took white names often found themselves belonging fully to neither world. Trusted by no one, wanted by few, caught in the dangerous space between cultures. She reached into the folds of her dress again and pulled out the object she had been holding by the fire, placing it on the table between them with the careful precision of someone laying down a winning card. Tom's breath caught when he saw what it was, his coffee cup stopping halfway to his lips as recognition hit him like a cavalry charge. A cavalry insignia. 7th Cavalry, to be specific, tarnished with age and wear, but still clearly recognizable to anyone who had served in that legendary and ill-fated unit. The same regiment Tom had bled with and nearly died with on a ridge in Montana 7 years ago. The same unit that had been decimated at Little Bighorn, leaving the survivors scattered to the wind like ashes from a funeral pyre. "Where did you get that?" Tom asked, his voice carefully neutral, despite the storm of emotions churning in his chest. Elena's fingers tightened around the insignia, and for a moment Tom thought she wouldn't answer, that whatever secret the small piece of metal represented would remain locked away. Then she spoke, her voice so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it over the sound of rain on the cabin roof. "From the man I loved," she said, each word falling like a stone into still water. "Before they killed him." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire, heavy with implication and sorrow. Tom set down his coffee cup and studied her face, looking for deception and finding only the kind of pain that couldn't be manufactured, the kind of grief that lived in the bones and changed the way a person moved through the world. "What was his name?" Tom asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "James Mitchell," she replied without hesitation, her voice steady despite the tears that gathered in her eyes like storm clouds. "Private James Mitchell, 7th Cavalry. He was 22 years old when he died." Tom closed his eyes and let the name wash over him like a baptism in memory and regret. James Mitchell. Jimmy, they had called him around the campfire when the nights were muddy and the danger felt distant. A kid from Pennsylvania with a quick smile and a tendency to sing Irish ballads that reminded everyone of homes they might never see again. Tom remembered him clearly now, remembered the way he could make anyone laugh even when the rations were short and the Apache were closing in like wolves around a dying campfire. "I knew him," Tom said quietly, the admission coming from someplace deeper than conscious decision. "Good soldier, good man, best kind of man." Elena's eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected this confirmation, as if the coincidence was too large and strange to be believed. "You served together." "I was his sergeant," Tom replied, the words carrying the weight of responsibility and failure that had haunted him for 7 years. "Before Little Bighorn, before everything went to hell, and good men started dying for the ambitions of politicians and fools." The admission opened a door between them, and Tom could see Elena processing this information, trying to decide what it meant for her situation and her future. Two people connected by tragedy and loss, thrown together by chance or fate, or the cruel mathematics of a frontier where everyone eventually lost someone they couldn't afford to lose. "He talked about you," Elena said suddenly, her voice gaining strength as memory overtook grief. "In his letters, Sergeant Harrison, who looked after the young soldiers like they were his own sons, who made sure everyone knew their game and came home alive when the shooting was over." The words hit Tom harder than any physical blow could have, cutting through the armor of cynicism and self-loathing he had built around his heart. He had not succeeded in bringing everyone home. Too many had died under his watch. Too many good men lost to bullets and disease and the simple, brutal mathematics of frontier warfare. Jimmy Mitchell among them, dying far from home in a war that made sense to politicians, but not to the men who fought it. "I failed him," Tom said, the words coming out before he could stop them. Raw and honest as a confession in a burning church. Failed all of them. Elena leaned forward, her dark eyes intense with sudden passion, blazing with the kind of certainty that could move mountains or start wars. "No," she said firmly, her voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. James died because of treachery, not because of you. He died because someone betrayed him, sold him out for money and politics and the kind of ambition that eats men's souls. Tom looked up sharply, feeling something cold and dangerous stir in his chest. What do you mean? Elena's hand went to the pocket of her dress, and she pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and worn soft from much handling, like a prayer book or a love letter. She placed it on the table between them with the same careful precision she had used with the insignia, her fingers still touching one corner as if she couldn't quite bring herself to let it go. The last letter he wrote me, she said, her voice breaking slightly on the words. 3 days before they killed him. Before they made it look like an Apache raid and buried the truth with his body. Tom stared at the letter, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might contain and what it might demand of him. Letters from dead men were dangerous things, full of truths that the living might not want to hear and responsibilities that the survivors might not be able to bear. But Elena was watching him with such intensity, such desperate hope, that he finally reached out and unfolded the paper with trembling hands. The handwriting was Jimmy's, no doubt about that. Tom recognized the careful script, the way the young man had formed his letters with the painstaking precision of someone who had learned to write late in life and still treated it as a sacred act. The date at the top made Tom's blood run cold and his vision blur with sudden rage. June 23rd, 1876. 2 days before Little Bighorn. 2 days before Jimmy died screaming in the Montana dust. My dearest Elena, the letter began, and Tom could hear Jimmy's voice in every carefully formed word, could see the young man hunched over a camp table by candlelight, writing what he somehow knew would be his last message to the woman he loved. If you are reading this, then the worst has happened and I am gone from this world. But I need you to know the truth about why I will not be coming home to make you my wife as we planned. Tom read on, his hands growing steadier even as his heart began to race with a familiar combat rhythm that had carried him through countless battles. The letter detailed a conversation Jimmy had overheard between Colonel Patterson and a civilian named Dutch Vanderberg, conducted in hushed tones behind the colonel's tent when they thought no one was listening except the desert wind and the coyotes calling in the distance. They had been discussing weapons sales to Apache raiders, using the subsequent attacks to justify seizing land from both white settlers and Indian tribes, playing all sides against each other while they lined their pockets with blood money and human misery. They are selling rifles and ammunition to Running Bear's band, the letter continued in Jimmy's careful script, each word formed with the painstaking precision of a man who knew his life hung in the balance. Then using the attacks as justification to demand more troops and bigger budgets from Washington. Patterson gets his promotions and political connections. Vanderberg gets the mineral rights to all the seized land, and everyone else gets buried in unmarked graves. I tried to report what I heard to Captain Benteen, but Patterson found out about my suspicions somehow. He called me into his tent yesterday and told me that spreading seditious lies about my commanding officer was a court-martial offense, maybe something worse than a military trial. Tom felt his jaw clench as he read the next paragraph, recognizing the kind of fear that must have driven Jimmy to put these dangerous words on paper, despite knowing that discovery meant certain death. I know they mean to silence me permanently, Elena. Patterson has been watching me ever since I tried to warn the captain, and some of his pet corporals have been asking careful questions about my loyalty to the regiment and my commitment to following orders without question. I think they plan to make sure I don't survive the next engagement with hostile forces. If something happens to me, if they make it look like I died heroically in battle against Apache raiders, you must get this information to someone who can act on it. Someone with the authority and courage to investigate these crimes. The attacks on your people are not random raids for horses and cattle and revenge. They are carefully planned, orchestrated by men who profit from the bloodshed on both sides of this manufactured conflict. Tom's hands were shaking now as he read the final paragraph, feeling the weight of a dead man's desperate trust settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket that would never be lifted. I love you, Elena Martinez, daughter of Running Bear, and I am deeply sorry that I will not live to make you my wife and give our children the life they deserve in a world where Apache and white can live in peace. But promise me you will survive this war they are creating. Promise me you will find someone who will protect you and value you as I do, someone worthy of the love you carry in your heart. And promise me above all else that you will not let them get away with what they have done to both our peoples. The truth has to matter for something, or good men die for nothing, and evil triumphs by default. And I cannot bear the thought that my death will be meaningless. The letter was signed simply James and sealed with a drop of wax that had long since crumbled away, leaving only the ghost impression of what had once been a young soldier's final act of love and desperate defiance against a corrupt system that had marked him for death. Tom set the letter down carefully on the wooden table, his mind reeling with implications that stretched far beyond one dead private's tragic fate. Colonel Patterson. He knew that name all too well, remembered the man's cold, calculating eyes and ruthless political ambitions, the way he had maneuvered to stay safely at headquarters during Little Bighorn, while better men rode out to die for his career advancement. Patterson had always been too clean after battles, too quick to claim credit for other officers' victories, too eager to volunteer for assignments that kept him away from actual fighting. If Jimmy's letter was true, and Tom's gut told him it was, then Patterson hadn't just been an ambitious coward. He had been a criminal mastermind of the worst sort, profiting from the deaths of soldiers and civilians alike while wearing the uniform of the United States Army. You believe it? Elena asked, watching Tom's face with the intensity of someone whose life hung on his answer, whose future depended entirely on whether this stranger would accept the word of a dead man against a living colonel. I believe Jimmy wrote it, Tom said slowly, choosing his words with the care of a man walking through a minefield where one wrong step meant death. And I believe he died because of what he knew. Patterson was always too clean after battles, too convenient in his survival when other officers didn't make it home. This explains a lot about how he managed to thrive while better men fell around him like autumn leaves. Elena nodded, tears gathering in her dark eyes but not falling, held back by the kind of iron will that had carried her across 100 miles of desert. They came for him 3 days after he wrote that letter, said he was killed in an Apache raid while on routine patrol, cut down in a heroic last stand against overwhelming numbers. But I know better than that. James was too good a soldier to be caught off guard like that, too smart and too careful to ride into an obvious ambush. And the wounds, she paused, swallowing hard as the painful memory washed over her. The wounds were made by cavalry sabers, not Apache weapons. I've seen enough of both to know the difference between a clean military blade and a stone tomahawk. Tom felt a familiar rage building in his chest, the same righteous anger that had driven him to leave the army and disappear into the wilderness after too many good men had died for the ambitions of politicians and profiteers. But this was different, more personal and immediate, because it involved Jimmy Mitchell and the woman he had loved enough to die trying to protect from a system that saw her as disposable. Why come to me? He asked, though part of him already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple or safe. After all this time, why seek out a broken-down ex-sergeant living in the middle of nowhere? Elena wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, a gesture that was somehow both vulnerable and defiant, showing the kind of strength that came from surviving things that would have destroyed weaker people. Because Patterson is coming here, to Arizona territory. I heard it from a trader at Fort Apache 3 days ago, a man who deals in information as much as supplies. Patterson has been promoted to full colonel, and he's been assigned to pacify the Apache threat in this region with whatever methods he deems necessary. He'll be here within the week with 2 full companies of cavalry and a mandate from Washington to do whatever it takes to secure the territory for white settlement and mineral exploitation. Tom's blood ran cold at the implications. Patterson in Arizona meant systematic extermination disguised as military necessity, a campaign of terror that would make the worst Indian wars look like family disagreements. The man would use any excuse to seize land and eliminate anyone who knew too much about his past crimes, and Elena Martinez definitely qualified as someone who knew far too much for her own good. But that's not the only reason I came, Elena continued, her voice growing softer and more uncertain as she prepared to reveal her most dangerous secret. I came because I have nowhere else to go, no one else to turn to in a world that wants me dead. My people cast me out when they learned I was carrying James's child. They said I had brought shame on the tribe by lying with a white soldier, that my mixed blood baby would be a curse on all Apache children yet to be born. The tribal council voted unanimously to banish me, to treat me as if I had never existed. And the white settlements won't take an Apache woman, even one with an Irish name and a dead soldier's baby growing in her belly. I'm caught between two worlds, belonging to neither, wanted by none. The admission hung between them like a confession of mortal sin, heavy with the weight of a society that had no room for love, that crossed racial boundaries. Tom looked at Elena more carefully now, noticing the subtle changes in her silhouette that his soldier's trained eye had missed in the lamplight and shadows. The slight swell of her abdomen beneath the carefully cut deerskin dress, the way she unconsciously protected her midsection when she moved, the maternal glow that seemed to emanate from her despite her exhaustion. She was with child, Jimmy Mitchell's child, and she had walked across 100 miles of unforgiving desert alone to escape a world that saw her pregnancy as an abomination rather than a miracle. "You're carrying his baby," he said, stating the obvious because sometimes the obvious needed to be acknowledged before it could be properly protected. 4 months, she replied, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly, with the protective gesture that all expectant mothers shared, regardless of race or circumstances. Maybe 5. It's hard to be sure when you're running for your life and eating whatever you can scavenge from the desert. The baby moves sometimes, especially at night when everything is quiet and I can feel the life growing inside me. James would have been so happy to know he was going to be a father. He talked about children all the time, about the kind of father he wanted to be, about raising sons and daughters who would grow up in a better world than the one we inherited. Her voice broke on the last words, and Tom saw her struggle to maintain the iron composure that had carried her this far across an impossible distance. He wanted to offer comfort, but found himself frozen by unfamiliar emotions and the crushing weight of responsibility that was settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket he could never remove. Thunder crashed overhead with renewed violence, shaking the cabin's foundation and rattling the windows in their frames. The rain began to fall harder, drumming against the roof like bullets on armor, and Tom stood up slowly to walk to the window. Outside, the storm was building to dangerous levels, the kind of weather that could wash away bridges and turn dry creek beds into raging torrents. He peered out into the darkness, his eyes automatically scanning for threats, even though he knew the storm provided better protection than any fortress wall. "You said men were following you," he said without turning around, his voice carefully neutral. "Professional bounty hunters from the sound of it. How close behind do you think they are?" "I don't know for certain, but probably closer than I'd like to admit. Dutch Vanderberg and at least 3 others, maybe more by now if Patterson has sent reinforcements. They've been tracking me for 2 days through some of the most difficult terrain in the territory, following the bounty Patterson quietly put out for Apache women of childbearing age. $500 dead or alive. No questions asked about how they died or what they might have known before their deaths." Tom's jaw tightened at the cold calculation behind such a bounty. $500 was more money than most men saw in 2 years of honest work. Enough to attract every desperate killer and moral weakling within 100 miles. It also meant that Patterson was deadly serious about eliminating all potential witnesses to his crimes, regardless of their age, gender, or condition. "What did you do to cover your trail?" he asked, his military mind automatically shifting into tactical mode, calculating distances and probabilities. Like a chess master planning moves several turns ahead. "Everything James taught me during our time together. I rode through streams whenever possible to break up the horse's scent trail, doubled back twice to confuse anyone trying to follow the physical tracks, even tried to make it look like I was heading south toward Mexico instead of east toward your ranch. But my horse was getting tired from the constant travel, and I didn't have time for truly elaborate deceptions. If Vanderberg's men are any good at tracking, and Patterson wouldn't hire men who weren't experts at their craft, they'll eventually sort through my misdirections and find the real trail that leads directly here." Tom nodded grimly, recognizing the tactical situation for what it was. Professional bounty hunters would almost certainly have Apache scouts working for them, men who had sold their loyalty for white man's gold and could read sign in the desert like scholars reading books. Men who could distinguish between false trails and real ones, who understood how a desperate woman might think when trying to evade pursuit. Elena's attempts at misdirection might buy them a few precious hours, maybe a full day if luck was with them, but not much more than that. "There's something else," Elena said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make their situation even more dangerous than it already was. "Something I haven't told you yet. Something that makes our circumstances far worse than you might imagine." Tom turned from the window, sensing that whatever revelation came next was going to transform their already desperate situation into something approaching pure nightmare. The tension in Elena's voice warned him that she had been saving the worst news for last. "What is it?" Elena reached into the folds of her dress with trembling fingers and pulled out a small leather pouch, the kind Apache women traditionally use for carrying sacred objects or personal treasures of great spiritual significance. She opened it with exaggerated care and dumped the contents onto the wooden table beside Jimmy's letter. Tom leaned forward to see what she had revealed, and his breath caught in his throat like a man who had just been punched in the solar plexus. Gold coins, $20 pieces, at least 30 of them, gleaming in the lamplight like captured pieces of the sun itself. More money than most honest families would see in 3 years of backbreaking labor. Certainly far more than a displaced Apache woman should have been carrying while running for her life across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. "Where in God's holy name did you get that fortune?" Tom asked, though he was beginning to suspect that the answer would be one that complicated their lives beyond all reasonable measure. "From Dutch Vanderberg's personal saddlebags," Elena said with a note of grim satisfaction in her voice, as if the memory of her theft still provided some measure of pleasure despite the deadly consequences. "2 nights ago, when I was hiding in the rocks above their camp near Painted Canyon, listening to them plan my capture and murder. Vanderberg was drunk on whiskey and careless with his words, talking loud and boastful about how much Colonel Patterson was paying him to clean up loose ends before the colonel's official arrival in Arizona territory. He was bragging to his men about all the Apache women he had already killed for the bounty, describing in disgusting detail what he did to them before putting bullets in their heads. Tom stared at her with a mixture of admiration and horror, recognizing the kind of desperate courage that drove people to take impossible risks when survival was at stake. Not many individuals would have had the nerve to sneak into a professional killer's camp and steal from him, especially not a pregnant woman traveling alone through territory where every shadow might hide death. But then, not many people would have walked across 100 miles of desert to deliver a dead man's letter either. "So now you're not just a witness to Patterson's crimes and a target for his bounty hunters," he said slowly, the full implications beginning to crystallize in his mind like ice forming on a winter pond. "You're also a thief who robbed his most trusted killers of what probably represents months of blood money. They'll want more than just your death now. They'll want to make an example of you, something public and painful that warns others against crossing them." "I prefer to think of it as collecting evidence of criminal conspiracy," Elena replied with the ghost of a smile that didn't quite manage to reach her exhausted eyes. "That gold came directly from Patterson's personal war chest, payment for services rendered in eliminating inconvenient people who knew too much about his illegal business arrangements with Apache raiders. It's concrete proof of the financial connection between them, physical evidence that the colonel is systematically paying bounty hunters to murder anyone who might expose his weapons dealing operation." Tom had to admit she made a valid point, even if her method of evidence collection was virtually guaranteed to get them both killed in the most unpleasant manner possible. The gold established a clear monetary link between Patterson and Vanderberg, demonstrating that their relationship involved far more than coincidental contact. Combined with Jimmy's detailed letter, it painted a comprehensive picture of systematic corruption and premeditated murder that reached far beyond a single dead private's accusations against his commanding officer. "You do realize this means they're not just hunting you for the original bounty anymore," he said, feeling obligated to point out the obvious escalation in their danger level. "And now it's deeply personal. Vanderberg will want his stolen gold returned, and he'll want to make a very painful, very public example of the person who dared to rob him. Probably something involving several days of creative torture before he finally allows you to die." I understand the risks perfectly, Elena said simply, her hand moving instinctively to protect her belly and the precious life growing within. But I couldn't just keep running forever, hiding in keys and eating cactus fruit while waiting for them to eventually catch up and kill me and my baby. At least this way, if something terrible happens to us, someone else might find the evidence and use it to stop Patterson's before he destroys more innocent families. The gold and the letter together tell a complete story that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore or cover up. Tom found himself looking at Elena Martinez with entirely new eyes, seeing not just a desperate woman seeking shelter, but a true warrior who had consciously chosen to fight back against impossible odds rather than simply flee until exhaustion claimed her. She reminded him powerfully of the best soldiers he had known during his military service, the ones who understood instinctively that some principles were worth dying for even when victory seemed mathematically impossible. The sound of multiple hoofbeats suddenly cut through the noise of the storm like a cavalry saber through silk, horses moving fast through the rain and darkness with the kind of purposeful urgency that meant business rather than casual travel. Tom's head snapped toward the window, his hand automatically reaching for his Winchester as years of combat training took control of his reflexes. The riders were still distant, perhaps a mile away based on the sound, but they were heading directly toward his isolated cabin with the kind of unwavering determination that suggested they knew exactly where they were going and why. "They found our trail," Elena said, her voice steady despite the unmistakable fear that flickered in her dark eyes like lightning in storm clouds. "Faster than I thought possible. Vanderberg must be even better at this deadly game than I gave him credit for." Tom grabbed his rifle and checked the action with automatic efficiency, muscle memory, and bitter experience taking over from conscious thought. His movements were quick and economical, wasting no motion as he prepared for the fight that was racing toward them through the darkness. "You said Vanderberg travels with at least 3 other men. Any idea what kind of weapons they carry?" "Standard bounty hunter equipment from what I could observe during my reconnaissance of their camp. Repeating rifles, probably Winchester or Henry models, plenty of ammunition, at least one shotgun for close work. Vanderberg himself carries 2 pistols and keeps a knife the size of a small sword strapped to his belt. The others are typical frontier hard cases, dangerous and well-armed, but not particularly intelligent or creative. They follow orders, collect their blood money, and don't ask complicated questions about the morality of their work." Tom nodded, his tactical mind already calculating angles of fire and defensive positions, planning the kind of fighting withdrawal that might give them a chance against superior numbers. His cabin was reasonably defensible if you understood its strengths and weaknesses, but it wasn't designed to withstand a prolonged siege by professional killers. They would need to be aggressive, unpredictable, and extremely fortunate if they wanted to see another sunrise. "Can you handle a weapon in your condition?" he asked, moving to his gun cabinet and selecting a double-barreled shotgun, the kind of firearm that was devastatingly effective at close range and didn't require perfect marksmanship to achieve deadly results. "James spent considerable time teaching me proper shooting techniques," Elena replied, accepting the heavy weapon with practiced ease and checking the loads with the automatic competence of someone who had been thoroughly trained. "I'm actually better with a rifle for precision work at longer distances, but this will serve perfectly well for the kind of close-quarters fighting we're likely to face tonight." Tom felt a grim smile cross his weathered face. Jimmy Mitchell had indeed trained his woman well, teaching her the practical skills she would need to survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy her. It was exactly the kind of thoughtful preparation that had made Jimmy an excellent soldier, the attention to crucial details that might be the difference between life and death in the next few hours. The sound of approaching hoofbeats was growing steadily louder, and Tom could now see the faint flickering glow of torches through the storm, wavering lights that looked like malevolent spirits dancing in the rain-soaked darkness. 4 riders, exactly as Elena had predicted, coming up the narrow trail with the confidence of predators who believed they held every possible advantage. They were about to discover how wrong that assumption could be. "Listen carefully," Tom said, moving systematically through the cabin to extinguish the oil lamps that would otherwise make them visible through the windows, like targets in a carnival shooting gallery. "When the shooting starts, stay low and keep moving between positions. Don't remain in one spot long enough for them to pinpoint your location, And don't try to be heroic. We just need to make them pay a much higher price than they're willing to accept for their blood money." Elena nodded, her face set in lines of determination that reminded Tom of veteran soldiers preparing for battle, men who had already accepted the possibility of death and were focused entirely on making their sacrifice count for something meaningful. "What about afterward? Even if we somehow manage to drive them off tonight, Patterson will certainly send more men. Better men. This conflict won't end with one small victory, will it?" Tom considered the question carefully as he positioned himself at the front window, rifle ready, watching the approaching torchlights with the kind of calm focus that had kept him alive through dozens of similar situations. She was absolutely right, of course. Tonight's desperate fight would only be the opening battle in a much larger war, not the decisive engagement that would end their troubles. But sometimes a man had to focus on immediate survival, trusting that tomorrow would bring its own opportunities and solutions. "After tonight, assuming we live through it, we'll have options we don't currently possess," he said. "Perhaps we can get Jimmy's letter and Vanderberg's gold to someone in the territorial government who isn't already in Patterson's pocket. Maybe we can locate other people who have their own reasons for wanting Patterson's criminal enterprise exposed and destroyed. But first we have to survive the next hour, and that's going to require every bit of skill and luck we can muster." The approaching riders were now close enough that Tom could hear their voices over the storm, harsh laughter, and crude comments about what they planned to do with Elena before they collected their bounty money. They were the kind of men who had long ago crossed the line from professional necessity into sadistic pleasure, who genuinely enjoyed the suffering they inflicted on their victims. Tom had encountered their type before in frontier saloons and on Civil War battlefields, and he knew they could be defeated if you hit them hard enough and fast enough to shatter their confidence. "They're slowing down," Elena whispered from her carefully chosen position at the side window, peering through a narrow crack in the wooden shutters, "probably trying to decide on the best approach to the cabin without walking directly into a carefully prepared ambush." Tom watched through his own observation point as the four men drew rein approximately 50 yards from his front door, huddling together in urgent conference like generals planning a major campaign. In the flickering torchlight, he could see Dutch Vanderberg clearly now, a massive man with the kind of brutally scarred face that suggested violence had been his profession for many years. The others were exactly what he had expected, typical frontier predators, heavily armed and eager for trouble, but lacking the intelligence to think more than one move ahead. One of them pointed directly toward the cabin and made some comment that caused the others to laugh with the kind of ugly amusement that suggested Elena's fate had already been decided in graphic detail. Vanderberg nodded approvingly and began issuing orders, dividing his men to surround the building in a classic pincer movement. It was basic military tactics, nothing particularly sophisticated, but it would be devastatingly effective if Tom and Elena simply remained passive targets waiting to be overwhelmed. Tom had absolutely no intention of remaining passive about anything. "When I open fire, count to 3, then smash out the back window and head for the barn," he instructed Elena. "I'll create enough noise and confusion to cover your escape, then follow you as soon as the tactical situation permits." "I already told you I'm not running away from this fight," Elena said with absolute finality, her voice carrying the kind of unshakable determination that brooked no argument from anyone. "We stand together against whatever comes, or we don't stand at all. James would have expected that kind of courage from me, and I expect it from myself." Tom started to argue with her decision, then looked into her eyes and realized it would be a complete waste of precious time and energy. Elena Martinez had made her choice with the same deliberate certainty he had made his own. They would face whatever came as allies, fighting for Jimmy's memory and their own survival and the innocent life she carried within her body. The bounty hunters were spreading out now, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who had executed this particular maneuver many times before against victims who lacked the training to mount effective resistance. Tom waited patiently until they were fully committed to their chosen positions, then took careful aim at Vanderberg through the crack in his shutters, leading the target slightly to compensate for movement and distance. The Winchester spoke with thunderous authority, its report echoing across the desert like the voice of divine judgment. Vanderberg spun violently from his saddle with a scream of pain and rage that carried clearly over the storm, clutching desperately at his shoulder where Tom's bullet had found its intended mark. Not a killing shot, unfortunately, but certainly enough to remove him from the immediate fighting and demonstrate to his men that this would not be the easy slaughter they had anticipated. The remaining three bounty hunters scattered like startled animals, seeking whatever cover the rocky terrain could provide, while returning wildfire that splintered wood and shattered glass throughout the cabin. Elena's shotgun responded with devastating effect from the side window, the heavy charge of buckshot making one of their attackers scream and retreat deeper into the darkness, cursing creatively while bleeding from multiple wounds. Tom worked his rifle's lever action and immediately shifted to a different firing position, refusing to give the enemy a stationary target they could concentrate their efforts on eliminating. A bullet whined through the exact space where his head had been just moments before, and he responded with two carefully aimed shots that forced another bounty hunter to abandon his cover and seek better protection behind a large boulder. The battle quickly settled into a deadly game of tactical cat and mouse, with Tom and Elena firing from multiple windows while their attackers attempted to advance close enough to storm the cabin directly. Minutes stretched endlessly like hours, punctuated by brilliant muzzle flashes and the constant crash of gunfire that echoed off the surrounding hills like an artillery bombardment. Tom's ammunition supply was distinctly limited, and he knew their enemies would eventually devise some method to smoke them out or simply burn the entire structure down around them. Then Elena suddenly called out from her position, her voice tight with pain and barely controlled shock. "Tom, I've been hit!" Tom's blood turned into ice as he spun toward Elena's voice, abandoning his firing position to see her slumped against the cabin wall beneath the side window. Her left arm hung useless at her side, and dark blood was spreading across the front of her deerskin dress like spilled wine on clean cloth. Her face had gone pale with shock in the beginning stages of blood loss, but her eyes remained alert and defiant, burning with the same fierce determination that had carried her across 100 miles of desert. "How bad is the wound?" he asked urgently, not daring to take his full attention from the windows where death might appear at any moment, his rifle still trained on the darkness beyond the shattered glass. "Clean through the shoulder, I think," she managed through gritted teeth, though Tom could see the tremendous effort it cost her to remain upright against the wall. "Missed the bone, but there's considerable bleeding. I can still fight if necessary. Just need to adjust my grip on this shotgun and find a way to brace it properly." Before Tom could respond to her stubborn courage, a new and distinctly ominous sound cut through the storm like a cavalry saber through silk. More hoofbeats, coming fast from the direction of the main trail that connected his isolated ranch to Fort Apache and the wider world beyond the desert. Multiple riders this time, at least 6 or 7 horses, moving with the kind of military precision that spoke of professional soldiers rather than bounty hunters or casual travelers. Tom's heart sank like a stone thrown into the deepest well. Reinforcements for Vanderberg's men, or perhaps Colonel Patterson himself, arriving ahead of his official schedule with a hand-picked squad of loyal soldiers to personally oversee the elimination of inconvenient witnesses who knew too much about his criminal activities. Either possibility spelled certain doom for him and Elena, transforming their already desperate situation into something approaching complete and utter hopelessness. But as the new arrivals drew closer to the besieged cabin, something unexpected and potentially miraculous began to happen. The bounty hunters who had been methodically trying to murder them suddenly stopped firing entirely, their weapons falling silent as if some invisible hand had commanded a ceasefire. Tom could hear Dutch Vanderberg shouting urgent warnings to his men from whatever cover he had found after taking Tom's bullet to the shoulder, his voice carrying a tone of confusion and growing fear rather than the confidence of a predator closing in for the kill. Then came the sound that Tom had been simultaneously dreading and hoping for since this nightmare began. Cavalry bugles cutting through the storm with crystalline clarity, the unmistakable call of federal troops riding hard toward the sound of gunfire. Professional soldiers responding to trouble with the disciplined efficiency that came from excellent training and years of experience under competent leadership. Tom felt a brief surge of hope before cold reality reasserted itself like a slap across the face with an iron gauntlet. These were almost certainly Patterson's advanced scouts, arriving early to clean up loose ends before the colonel's official assumption of command in Arizona territory. Men who would follow orders without question or hesitation, who would accept whatever story their commanding officer chose to tell about finding the bodies of a renegade ex-soldier and a wanted Apache woman guilty of unspecified crimes against the United States government. The cavalry charge swept through the bounty hunters' positions like a hurricane through a house of cards, scattering Vanderburg's surviving men and sending them fleeing into the night like shadows before the first light of sunrise. Tom watched from his window as blue-uniformed soldiers efficiently rounded up the hired killers who hadn't managed to escape, their carbines trained with professional competence on men who had been eager to commit murder for money just moments before. A single rider separated himself from the main group and approached the cabin slowly, his hands raised high to demonstrate peaceful intentions to anyone watching from inside the building. Tom kept his Winchester ready, but refrained from firing as the man called out through the continuing the storm, his voice carrying the unmistakable authority of long military service and command responsibility. "Thomas Harrison, this is Sergeant Sean Murphy, 10th Cavalry Regiment. Buffalo soldiers. We need to talk immediately about matters of mutual concern." Tom's heart nearly stopped beating entirely as recognition hit him like a physical blow. Sean Murphy. Sean Murphy, his oldest friend and fellow survivor of that blood-soaked ridge in Montana where Custer's grandiose dreams had died along with so many good men who deserved better than following a glory-seeking fool into a carefully prepared trap. If Murphy was here in Arizona territory, riding with the famous Buffalo soldiers and calling out Tom's name, it meant the situation was far more complex and dangerous than Tom had ever imagined. But it also suggested the remarkable possibility that they might finally have a genuine ally in their desperate fight against Patterson's expanding web of corruption and systematic murder. Tom opened the cabin door cautiously and stepped onto the covered porch, his rifle still ready, but pointed toward the ground in a gesture of qualified trust mixed with appropriate caution. Murphy dismounted from his cavalry horse and approached on foot, and Tom could see his weathered Irish face clearly beneath the brim of his regulation cavalry hat. The years since Little Bighorn had added lines around his eyes and new scars along his jaw, but it was definitely the same man who had saved Tom's life during the chaotic retreat from that cursed battlefield 7 years ago. "Sean Murphy, you magnificent Irish bastard!" Tom called out, allowing himself a moment of genuine relief, despite everything that hung in the balance like a sword over their heads. "What in God's holy name brings you to my little corner of earthly purgatory?" Official orders from Washington, delivered through proper military channels this time, Murphy replied with the kind of grim smile that suggested he brought both good news and bad news in equal measure, like a messenger bearing mixed tidings from distant authorities. Not the manufactured garbage and outright lies that Patterson has been spreading throughout the territory like poison in a well. "We need to discuss Colonel Patterson and his criminal activities in detail, because it turns out you and the lady aren't the only people who want to see him brought to justice for his crimes." Tom felt something that might have been genuine hope beginning to stir in his chest for the first time in years, an emotion so unfamiliar after his long isolation that he almost failed to recognize it. Perhaps the fight wasn't over after all, despite the overwhelming odds they had been facing. Perhaps justice remained possible, even here on the frontier where justice was usually whatever the man with the most guns and the best political connections decided it should be. "Come inside where we can talk privately without half the territory listening," Tom said, stepping back to allow Murphy entry while keeping one eye on the soldiers who were still securing the area and processing their prisoners. "But I should warn you in advance, it's an extremely complicated story with more dangerous implications than you might expect, even knowing Patterson's reputation." "The most important ones usually are," Murphy replied with a knowing grin that reminded Tom of exactly why they had been such close friends during their Army service, before war and politics had scattered them to different corners of a continent that seemed determined to consume its own children. "And I've got the entire night to hear every detail, plus some intelligence of my own that should interest you considerably." As Murphy stepped across the threshold into the warm cabin, Tom caught sight of Elena still sitting propped against the wall, her wounded shoulder roughly bandaged with strips torn from her dress, but her dark eyes remaining alert and suspicious as she evaluated this new arrival. She was studying this newcomer with the same careful assessment she had initially applied to Tom himself when she first appeared at his door, trying to determine whether Sean Murphy represented salvation or simply a different variety of mortal danger dressed in military blue. "Ma'am," Murphy said respectfully, touching the brim of his hat as he noticed Elena's condition and the obvious signs that she had been wounded in the recent fighting. "Sergeant Sean Murphy, 10th Cavalry, at your service. That looks like a nasty wound you've taken there." "I'll survive," Elena replied tersely, though Tom could see the tremendous effort it required for her to maintain her defensive posture despite the pain that must be coursing through her injured shoulder. The question that matters is whether any of us will live long enough for survival to actually matter in any meaningful way. Murphy's experienced eyes took in the bullet holes that decorated the cabin walls like deadly artwork, the shattered glass scattered across the wooden floor like diamonds in lamplight, and the unmistakable signs of a fierce firefight recently concluded with uncertain results. His professional assessment was quick and thorough, the kind of tactical evaluation that separated veteran soldiers from inexperienced recruits. "Looks like you've both had quite an eventful evening already. Vanderberg and his crew of hired killers?" "You know about the bounty hunters?" Tom asked, genuinely surprised that Murphy seemed familiar with their specific enemies and the immediate threats they had been facing. "More than you might think," Murphy said grimly, accepting the chair Tom offered, while keeping his voice low enough that his words wouldn't carry beyond the cabin walls to potentially hostile ears. "Dutch Vanderberg has been operating throughout the territory for the past 6 months, always managing to stay one step ahead of any official investigation or military pursuit. Until tonight, we couldn't prove definitively that he was working directly for Patterson, but catching him in the act of trying to murder federal witnesses changes everything about our legal position." Tom poured coffee into 3 tin cups, the familiar ritual helping to calm his nerves while his mind processed the implications of Murphy's words and what they might mean for their immediate future. Federal witnesses? That terminology suggests someone in Washington already knows about Patterson's activities and has been conducting some kind of investigation. "More than just knows about them," Murphy said, accepting his coffee gratefully, while the warmth seemed to revive his spirits after the long ride through the storm. "There's been a secret investigation running for nearly a year, ever since certain irregularities in weapons shipments and casualty reports started raising uncomfortable questions in the War Department. Patterson has been very careful, very clever about covering his tracks, but not quite careful enough to avoid notice entirely from people whose job it is to spot exactly these kinds of patterns." Elena leaned forward, despite her injury, wincing visibly as the movement pulled at her wounded shoulder and sent fresh pain shooting through her damaged arm. "What kind of irregularities specifically? We need to know how much you already understand about his operation." Murphy glanced between Tom and Elena, clearly weighing how much classified information he could safely share with civilians, even friendly ones who seemed to be fighting the same enemy. "Rifles and ammunition going missing from Army shipments at regular intervals, then mysteriously turning up in Apache hands during raids that always seemed to target very specific ranches and settlements. Always places where Patterson's civilian associates had recently shown interest in acquiring land rights for mining or railroad development. James wrote about overhearing Patterson and Vanderberg discussing exactly that kind of arrangement," Elena said, her voice growing stronger as she realized they might actually have official support for their accusations rather than being completely alone against a corrupt system. "Selling weapons to Apache raiders, then using the resulting attacks to justify seizing land from both white settlers and tribal holdings. A perfect system for enriching themselves while appearing to be patriotic soldiers defending civilization." "You're James?" Murphy asked, his attention sharpening with professional interest. "Would that be Private James Mitchell, 7th Cavalry Regiment, formerly assigned to Fort Abraham Lincoln?" Elena's eyes widened in surprise, and Tom could see hope beginning to bloom in her expression like flowers after desert rain. "You knew him personally?" "Knew of him through official channels," Murphy corrected carefully. Mitchell's name appeared in several reports that reached Washington before his death, reports describing suspicious activities he had observed. Unfortunately, those reports were subsequently buried by Patterson's supporters in the military hierarchy, but not before copies reached certain individuals who specialize in investigating military corruption and treason. Tom set down his coffee cup with perhaps more force than necessary, the ceramic making a sharp sound against the wooden table. Are you telling us that people in Washington knew Jimmy was in danger and did nothing whatsoever to protect him from Patterson's retaliation? I'm telling you that the investigation was in its very early stages when Mitchell was killed, Murphy said carefully, choosing his words with the precision of someone who understood the political sensitivities involved. The evidence wasn't strong enough yet to move against a full colonel with powerful political connections and friends in Congress. Unfortunately, Mitchell's death eliminated our primary source of information inside Patterson's operation, leaving the investigation without sufficient proof to proceed. Until now, Elena said quietly, understanding beginning to dawn in her dark eyes like sunrise over the desert. Exactly right. Your letter from Mitchell, combined with the gold you took from Vanderberg's personal funds, provides the concrete proof we've been desperately seeking for months. Physical evidence of criminal conspiracy that can't be dismissed or explained away by Patterson's allies, no matter how influential they might be. Tom stood up and began pacing the small cabin, his military mind working through tactical possibilities and potential complications like a chess master planning moves several turns ahead. What's Patterson's current status? How much time do we have before he arrives with his full command and makes any kind of legal resolution impossible? Less than you'd prefer, Murphy admitted with obvious reluctance. Patterson is scheduled to assume official command of territorial operations in 3 days, with 2 full companies of hand-picked cavalry and broad discretionary authority to deal with the Apache situation as he sees fit. Once he's established here with that kind of force and legal authority, removing him becomes exponentially more difficult, possibly impossible. So we have exactly 3 days to build a case strong enough to convince Washington to recall him before he can eliminate all the witnesses and evidence, Elena said, her tactical thinking proving as sharp as any experienced soldier's, despite her civilian status and lack of formal military training. Not quite that simple, Murphy said, his expression growing even more serious as he prepared to deliver additional bad news. Patterson has been moving faster than our intelligence sources anticipated. Our scouts report his advance elements are already en route, probably less than a day behind my own patrol. He's bringing a significant force with standing orders to suppress any Apache resistance with maximum prejudice, which means he's prepared to commit wholesale slaughter if necessary to achieve his objectives. Tom felt the walls of possibility closing around them like the sides of a carefully constructed trap, which means we need to move immediately tonight before his people arrive and make any kind of peaceful or legal resolution completely impossible. There's something else you need to know about your personal situation, Murphy continued, his reluctance to share additional bad news evident in his voice and body language. Patterson has been spreading carefully crafted stories about you throughout the territory, Tom, claiming you've gone renegade, that you're actively collaborating with Apache raiders against white settlements. He's painted you as a deserter and a traitor who needs to be brought in dead or alive for the safety of innocent civilians. Tom laughed bitterly, the sound carrying no humor whatsoever. Of course he has. Can't have inconvenient witnesses walking around when you're trying to build a political career on manufactured victories and stolen valor. And the good news is that my commanding officer, Colonel Williams at Fort Apache, doesn't believe Patterson's accusations for a moment. Williams fought alongside you during the war, remembers your service record and your character. He's the one who authorized this mission to extract you and any evidence you might possess before Patterson's forces arrive. Elena struggled to her feet, ignoring the obvious pain from her shoulder wound, as determination overrode physical discomfort. Extract us to where exactly? If Patterson has the kind of political influence you're suggesting, nowhere in Arizona territory will be safe for very long. Denver, Murphy said. Temporary relocation under federal protection while the investigation proceeds through official channels in Washington. Williams has connections in the territorial government who aren't in Patterson's pocket, honest officials who can ensure your testimony reaches the right authorities without being intercepted or suppressed. Tom considered the proposal, weighing the risks and benefits with the cold calculation that had kept him alive through numerous dangerous situations over the years. What about Elena's condition? She's 4 months pregnant and wounded. Can she handle that kind of arduous journey? "I've survived worse," Elena said firmly before Murphy could answer, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone who had already endured more than most people could imagine. "And I'll survive this too if it means stopping Patterson before he murders more innocent people for profit and political advancement." Murphy nodded approvingly at her determination. "There's a supply wagon departing Fort Apache tomorrow morning." My morning, officially carrying medical supplies to Denver, but with enough concealed space for passengers who need to travel discreetly without attracting attention. "If we can get you there safely, you'll be under federal protection within 48 hours. "That's assuming we can reach Fort Apache without running into Patterson's advance scouts," Tom pointed out. 15 miles of open country, some of it through terrain that's absolutely perfect for ambushes by anyone who knows the local geography. "Which is exactly why we're not taking the direct route that Patterson would expect," Murphy said, pulling a hand-drawn map from his jacket and spreading it across the table. "My patrol knows alternative trails through the mountains, paths that will add considerable distance, but avoid the main roads where Patterson's people will certainly be watching for any unusual activity." Tom studied the map carefully, his experienced eye tracing the proposed route through difficult terrain that would test both horses and riders to their limits. "This will take at least 8 hours of hard riding, probably more given Elena's condition and the need to avoid detection." "I can manage whatever's required," Elena insisted, though Tom could see the exhaustion in her eyes despite her fierce determination to see this through to the end. A new voice suddenly cut through their planning session like a knife through silk, cold and cultured, and carrying the unmistakable authority of command. "I'm afraid none of you will be managing anything except dying, and probably not as quickly as you might prefer." All three occupants of the cabin spun toward the sound, weapons appearing in practiced hands with the speed that came from years of training and bitter experience. Standing in the doorway, flanked by two soldiers in cavalry uniforms with their weapons already drawn and aimed, was a tall man with colonel's eagles gleaming on his shoulders and the kind of coldly handsome face that suggested considerable intelligence combined with a complete absence of conscience or moral restraint. Colonel Patterson had arrived ahead of schedule, and he was smiling the predatory smile of a man who believed he held all the winning cards in a game where the stakes were measured in human lives. "Sergeant Murphy," Patterson said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than life and death matters of the gravest importance, "I'm disappointed but not particularly surprised to find you here interfering in official military business." Colonel Williams always was far too trusting of his subordinates' loyalty and discretion. Murphy's hand hovered near his service revolver, but the presence of Patterson's guards made any hostile action tantamount to suicide. "Colonel Patterson, you're not scheduled to assume command until next week according to all official communications. Plans change when circumstances require flexibility and immediate action," Patterson replied smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced ease of a career politician. "Especially when reliable sources report that wanted criminals and enemy collaborators are operating freely in my designated area of responsibility, threatening the safety of law-abiding citizens." Tom kept his rifle ready, but knew that any sudden movement would result in immediate death for all of them. "Let me guess. Dutch Vanderberg managed to escape our little party and reported our location before we could silence him permanently." "Vanderberg is a useful tool for certain types of work, but hardly my only source of intelligence in this territory. I've been monitoring this situation carefully since Miss McKenna first appeared at Fort Apache asking uncomfortable questions about dead soldiers and missing weapons. Did you really think such inquiries would go unnoticed?" Elena's face went pale as she realized the full implications of what Patterson was revealing. "You've been tracking me from the very beginning. Everything that's happened, of course I have. Did you really think you could walk around carrying evidence of my business arrangements without attracting my immediate attention? I've been allowing you to run free, using you as bait to flush out any other potential problems that might require elimination, rather like using a wounded deer to attract wolves that need to be eliminated." Patterson stepped further into the cabin, his guards maintaining careful positions that covered all three occupants without blocking their commander's line of sight or field of fire. The beauty of this situation is that it solves multiple problems simultaneously. A rogue ex-sergeant with dangerous knowledge, a traitorous current sergeant who's forgotten his duty, and a dangerous Apache agitator spreading lies about the military. All eliminated while heroically resisting lawful arrest. Very convenient for everyone concerned. People in Washington know about your activities, Murphy said desperately, trying to find some leverage that might give them a chance to survive. Killing federal investigators will only make things infinitely worse for you. Patterson's smile widened, becoming even more predatory and self-satisfied. What federal investigators? I see only 3 criminals who were unfortunately killed while resisting lawful military authority in the performance of their treasonous activities. Any evidence they might have claimed to possess will naturally be revealed as fabricated materials designed to undermine legitimate government operations and military effectiveness. Tom felt the familiar calm that always descended on him in moments of mortal danger, the crystalline clarity of thought that had carried him through countless battles and impossible situations. Patterson was making the classic mistake of overconfident villains throughout history, talking too much instead of simply eliminating his enemies immediately and efficiently. There's just one significant problem with your carefully crafted plan, Colonel, Tom said quietly, his voice carrying a confidence he didn't entirely feel. Which would be, what exactly? You're assuming we're the only people who know about your crimes and current location. Patterson's confidence flickered slightly, the first crack in his perfect facade. Explain that statement immediately. Murphy didn't come here alone tonight. His patrol is stationed strategically throughout this area, with specific orders to report back to Colonel Williams if they don't hear from him within a predetermined time frame. How long before they come looking for you, Sergeant? Murphy caught on immediately to the desperate game they were playing. 2 hours at most, sir. And they have copies of all the evidence we've collected, with orders to deliver it directly to Washington if anything happens to us. It was a complete fabrication, but Patterson couldn't be certain of that fact without risking exposure of his entire operation. Tom watched the colonel's face carefully, looking for signs of doubt or uncertainty that might create an opening they could exploit. Furthermore, Elena added, understanding the psychological warfare they were waging, I wasn't the only person James told about what he discovered. There are others, people in positions of authority, who will ask very difficult questions if anything suspicious happens to us. Another complete lie, but a plausible one that added to Patterson's growing unease about the security of his position and the potential consequences of his actions. Patterson's hand moved to his service revolver, his facade of civilized control beginning to crack under the pressure of uncertainty. Perhaps it would be simpler to eliminate all potential complications immediately rather than attempting to manage an increasingly complex situation with too many variables. Patterson's eyes went cold and deadly as his patience finally snapped. Enough of these games! He drew his service revolver in one fluid motion, aiming directly at Elena's heart. You've cost me everything, you Apache bitch. Time to collect what's owed. Tom moved faster than thought, throwing himself between Patterson and Elena just as the colonel's finger tightened on the trigger. The bullet meant for Elena tore through Tom's shoulder, spinning him around, but he managed to grab Patterson's wrist and wrestle for control of the weapon. Murphy lunged forward to help, but Patterson's guards swung their rifles toward him. Elena, despite her wounded shoulder, raised the shotgun with her good arm and fired both barrels into the cabin ceiling, the thunderous blast causing everyone to flinch and giving Tom the split second he needed to twist the revolver away from Patterson. It's over, Colonel, Tom gasped, blood flowing from his shoulder wound as he held Patterson's own gun against the man's temple. Your war ends here. That would be an extremely poor decision, Colonel, said a new voice from outside the cabin, carrying the unmistakable authority of law enforcement. Everyone in the room turned toward the doorway as another figure appeared, this one wearing the uniform of a territorial marshal with a silver star that gleamed in the lamplight. Behind him stood 6 more armed men, all wearing the same badge and carrying weapons trained with professional competence on Patterson's guards. Marshal Harrison, Patterson said, his voice tight with suppressed fury at this unexpected complication. This is a military matter completely outside your civilian jurisdiction. Actually, Colonel, murder and weapons trafficking are very much within territorial jurisdiction, especially when they involve crimes against civilian populations. I have properly executed warrants for your arrest signed by the territorial judge in Tucson. Tom stared at the marshal, recognizing something familiar in the man's weathered features and bearing. Harrison? Any family relation to someone we might know? My brother Jacob, Elena said suddenly, understanding flooding her voice with relief and hope. I sent word to him 3 days ago through Apache runners, telling him where I was heading and why. He must have brought federal marshals from Tucson to provide legal authority. Jacob Harrison stepped fully into the cabin, his badge and legal authority providing a shield of protection that even Patterson couldn't simply brush aside through military rank or political connections. Miss McKenna, Thomas, sorry it took so long to get here, but we needed proper warrants and sufficient force to handle this situation through legal channels rather than vigilante justice. Patterson's face went through a remarkable transformation, shifting from confident authority to desperate calculation in the span of mere seconds. This is obviously a conspiracy involving multiple parties attempting to undermine legitimate military operations through fabricated evidence and completely false accusations. We'll let a federal court determine what's fabricated and what's genuine evidence of criminal activity. Marshal Harrison replied calmly. As the excitement of Patterson's capture began to settle, Elena moved closer to Tom, her hand trembling as she touched his arm. Tom, there's something else I haven't told you. Something about the baby. Her voice broke slightly. I lost James's child 3 weeks after I left the reservation. The stress, the running, the lack of food. I miscarried. And the reservation doctor told me I may never be able to carry a child to term again. Tom's face showed no disappointment, only gentle understanding. Elena, that doesn't change anything between us. Not one damn thing. But you wanted to build a family, to raise James's child. I wanted you, Tom said simply. The rest we'll figure out together. There are plenty of Apache children who need homes after all this violence, his voice carrying the steady authority of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous criminals. In the meantime, Colonel Patterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, treason against the United States, and weapons trafficking with hostile forces. The next few minutes unfolded with the swift efficiency of a well-planned and carefully coordinated military operation. Patterson's guards, faced with overwhelming odds and legitimate legal authority they couldn't challenge without committing additional federal crimes, surrendered their weapons without resistance. The colonel himself submitted to arrest with the cold dignity of a professional soldier, but Tom could see the calculations continuing behind his eyes, already planning appeals and political maneuvers that might yet save his career and freedom. But there were more surprises yet to be revealed. As the marshals were securing Patterson in shackles, another figure appeared in the doorway, an elderly Apache man with the bearing of a chief, flanked by 2 younger warriors who moved with the fluid grace of professional fighters. Running Bear, Elena gasped, struggling to her feet despite her injury. Father, I was told the council had banished me permanently. The old chief's weathered face showed no emotion as he studied his daughter, taking in her wounded condition and obvious exhaustion. The council was deceived by lies and false promises. We have learned the truth about who killed our people and why. The white colonel's crimes against our tribe are now exposed. Patterson's face went even paler as he realized the full extent of his predicament. Not only had his criminal network been exposed to federal authorities, but his victims among the Apache tribes were now aligned against him as well. How did you know to come here? Tom asked, still trying to understand the complex web of communications that had brought all these forces together at the right moment. My daughter sent word through old pathways, Running Bear explained, messages that reached not only her brother among the white lawmen, but also those of us who remember the old alliances between honest soldiers and Apache warriors. We have watched and waited, gathering our own evidence of the white colonel's betrayal. Marshal Harrison stepped forward, addressing the Apache chief with obvious respect. Chief Running Bear, your testimony will be crucial in building the complete case against Patterson. Federal prosecutors will need to hear from all his victims. We will speak truth in the white man's court, Running Bear replied solemnly. Justice must come for those who profit from the suffering of both our peoples. As dawn broke over the Arizona territory, painting the desert landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Tom found himself standing on his cabin porch beside Elena, watching as federal marshals loaded Patterson and his remaining accomplices into a heavily guarded prison wagon for transport to trial in Denver. The immediate danger had finally passed, but he knew their troubles were far from completely over. "What happens now?" Elena asked, her wounded arm properly treated and secured in a professional sling provided by the territorial doctor who had arrived with the marshals. "Now we testify," Tom replied, watching the prison wagon disappear into the distance. "We tell the complete truth about what happened, and we trust that justice still means something in this country, despite all evidence to the contrary." "And after the trial is finished?" Tom considered the question carefully, looking out at his isolated ranch and thinking about the quiet life he had built here in the wilderness, and how it had been forever changed by Elena's arrival. "I suppose that depends on whether you'd be interested in staying here permanently. This isn't much of a place by most standards, but it could be a good place to raise a child safely." Elena smiled, her hand moving instinctively to her belly, where Jimmy Mitchell's son or daughter continued to grow strong and healthy despite everything they had endured together. James would have liked that idea very much. He always said children deserve to grow up somewhere safe, somewhere they could learn to be better than their parents and build a more just world. Tom nodded, understanding flowing between them like water finding its natural course after a long drought. They had been brought together by tragedy and violence, forged in the crucible of shared danger and common purpose. But perhaps they could build something beautiful and lasting from the ashes of what had been destroyed. "Then that's exactly what we'll do," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a solemn promise. "We'll build something better than what came before." As the prison wagon carrying Colonel Patterson toward justice disappeared into the distance, Tom and Elena stood together in the golden morning light, no longer running from a violent past, but ready to face whatever future they could create together in this harsh but beautiful land that had tested them both and found them worthy of survival. 3 years later, Tom Harrison stood on the same porch, watching Elena teach their 3 adopted Apache children how to tend the vegetable gardens she had planted where the old corral used to be. Little Running Wolf, 8 years old, carefully watered the corn stalks while his sisters, Maria and Ayana, ages 6 and 7, pulled weeds with the serious concentration of young farmers. Colonel Patterson had been sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. His weapons trafficking network had been completely dismantled, and the Arizona Territory was finally finding real peace between Apache and white settlers. Elena looked up from the garden, one hand shading her eyes, the other resting on the slight swell of her belly. Against all odds and the reservation doctor's grim predictions, she was carrying their first biological child together, due in the spring when the desert would bloom again. "Dinner's ready," she called to her husband and children, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch that had become something neither Tom nor Elena could have imagined that first desperate night. Not just a home, but a sanctuary for lost souls finding their way back to hope. Tom smiled as he watched his family gather around Elena, Apache and Irish voices mixing in the evening air. Jimmy Mitchell would have been proud to see what had grown from the seeds of his sacrifice. This was the better world he had dreamed of in his final letter. A place where love transcended the artificial boundaries men drew between peoples, where children could grow up safe and strong regardless of the color of their skin or the blood in their veins. The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly around them, no longer a landscape of fear and violence, but a canvas for building the future Jimmy had died hoping to see.